Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, as we now know, Theresa May's decision to call June's snap general election cost taxpayers more than £140 million. We heard that earlier on, more than once, just slightly below the estimated £142 million spent on the EU referendum. Mrs May announced the election calling for a stronger mandate going into Brexit negotiations 3 years earlier than required under the Fixed-Term Parliaments Act, of which we've heard nothing more, but now has to rely on a deal with the DUP to survive key votes. So what went wrong for Mrs May? Elizabeth Glinker reports.
Who can you trust to have the strong and stable leadership? It's about ensuring that this country has a strong and stable government. Every vote for a local Conservative candidate is a vote for strong and stable leadership.
When asked to admit the worst thing she'd ever done, Theresa May admitted to running through fields of unharvested wheat as a child. But of course, that was before the disaster that was the 2017 general election campaign, an offence many Conservatives are still struggling to get over.
To see that result at 10 o'clock on the night of Thursday the 8th of June was absolutely shocking, to see that they actually lost their majority, and that's going to stay with people for a very long time.
From a 20-point lead in the polls to the loss of her Commons majority, just where did it all go wrong? Surprising your opponent may offer some advantage, but surprising your own side, well, that has its problems.
The cabinet was informed that morning. A lot of the people who would go on to run the election campaign were outside consultants who were, in some cases, not even in the country. So they had to rebuild very swiftly this machine. Build the car as we drive it was the term that they used.
But once they were in place, the machine that had worked so well in 2015 wasn't really firing on all cylinders. What's more, it was unclear who was in charge, or even what they were selling.
Mr. Crosby.
There was tension, a bit of a conflict towards the top of the campaign between two competing visions of what the Conservative Party should be offering. The first was continuity, strong and stable, and the other was that Theresa May was offering radical change. Because there wasn't really a clear chain of command, that meant that you didn't get one or the other of these ideas. At different points in the campaign, you got a mixture of both.
And if the political weather was starting to look a little unsettled, then things were about to get a whole lot worse.
This was a much more centralised, much more controlled and therefore much less consulted on manifesto than ever before. And there are ministers, but also people like the 1922 committee who represent backbench Conservative MPs who would ordinarily be consulted on some of these things, were not brought in until it was too late. And quite a lot of those MPs feel very strongly that had they been asked about what became known as the dementia tax, the social care policy, they would have been able to flag up beforehand that a lot of their voters would have been extremely unhappy about it.
Those voters that had been considered a sure thing at the beginning of the campaign began to drift away.
Is there an argument to say part of the problem was just the personality of the Prime Minister and her performance during the campaign?
I think it would be completely erroneous to try and pretend there weren't issues about the leadership offer of the Conservative Party, in the same way that it would be ridiculous to pretend the manifesto hadn't been a huge problem. But the way one very senior MP put it to me was, this campaign suffered from 10 or 12 problems where any one of them, if they hadn't happened, we might have hung on to our majority.
A lesson, perhaps, in what can happen if you choose the wrong path.
To be honest, it's a bit less exciting than I was expecting.
I wonder if Elizabeth's done anything more naughty than run through a wheat field. I won't ask you the same question, Daniel, for fear of the answer. Graham Brady, the chair of the 1922 Backbench Committee, in charge of Tory MPs, told me last week that almost everything went wrong in the Conservative campaign. Do you agree?
Well, I'll cling on to the word that he used, almost, as his get out to say, pretty much yes. I think it was pretty bad. But although everyone concentrates on the campaign, I think it's necessary to take one step back and add in another factor. The Conservative Party was running to have a third term at a time when personal incomes were going down. And I don't think we concentrated, when we looked at the gap between her and Jeremy Corbyn, enough on that right at the beginning of the campaign.
But the gap was huge, wasn't it, in terms of polling before the campaign? That's why she called the snap election.
If you look at, all the modelling of American elections, for example, if you are running for a third time and personal incomes are going in the wrong direction, you usually lose. So
but personal incomes had been going, if not totally in the wrong direction, hadn't been going up exactly, had they, during the post-crash?
By the way, obviously we'll come on to the campaign in a minute, because that was obviously not a great success. But I'm just saying that I'm not trying to take away from that. I'm just adding in another factor, which is in 2015, personal incomes were going up, and in 2017, the personal incomes were going down. When she called the election, because the polls were so big, we all, and I'm, absolutely of this number, assumed that it would be all right. But if you look at it in a historical perspective, it's not as surprising as it looks that a government that was running for a third term had a swing against it when personal incomes were going down, having previously been going up.
So the presidential style of the campaign didn't work, clearly. Do you think it came across as arrogant?
Well, it didn't work. I'm not sure. I think it probably did come across as arrogant, but actually I understood why they did it. It was linked to a belief that the Conservative Party was going to win with a different coalition than it had gone into the election.
But the presidential style campaign focuses on the leader and the person.
Exactly.
Was that the mistake?
Exactly. Well, it turned out to be an error, but I'll explain why. They were trying to get votes in places which never vote Conservative. And in order to win their majority, they had to get seats, and they in fact did win a few of those, but didn't win many.
But Labour won seats that have never ever been anything but Conservative.
And their attempt was to produce what is a long-term realignment in British politics, moving from the Conservative Party representing merely sort of prosperous, educated voters to less well-educated, less prosperous voters. And those people never vote Conservative. And I think a lot of focus group work said they won't vote Conservative, but they might vote for Theresa May. So that was the thinking behind it, and it wasn't. The problem was the campaign, of course, couldn't pull it off because people turned against her, and her popularity fell, partly because of the manifesto, partly because of performances early on in the campaign. That strategy then, which people had been criticising in a sort of beltway way, I think became a problem because you were linking yourself to something that wasn't as popular as it had been.
Right, and in terms of attracting those people perhaps who hadn't voted Conservative, what about the Conservative voters who were repelled, or at least stayed at home, by policy initiatives like the social care policy?
Look, what they were that was obviously a very big moment in the campaign and a big error. And it was all part of, if you looked at the manifesto, it was part of trying to win a new sort of voter. The problem is, you shouldn't go around sacking your voters. That's what the manifesto effectively ended up doing.
I mean, it was a critical error.
And it was a critical error. And without it, certainly the result would have been different. Although I think the headwinds against the Conservative Party were stronger than we all appreciated.
How long has she got, do you think? Because Graham Brady said again, for the moment, we're supporting her.
My own view, and I think, the view of any analyst, biased or not, and obviously I'm sort of biased one, is that she probably won't fight. She won't fight the next general election. I think it's highly unlikely that the Conservative Party is going to let her do that. But obviously, if you're asked the question, are you going to fight the next general election? And I've been a briefer for long enough to know you would answer the question, my intention is to go on and fight the election, and of course she said that. Would
you have advised her to give that answer, despite the fact that she had said that I'm here for as long as you want me? There are other forms of words you could have used rather than saying I'm not a quitter, I'll fight the next election.
Assuming that people only ask you the question once. If they ask you it more than once, you're soon in trouble. If you haven't answered it immediately, you'll then get asked it again. So it's like the techniques of these things. I've done loads and loads of preparation for people like John Major and William Hagan. You just end up having to answer the question that way. And by the way, I'm sure she would fight the general election if the Conservative Party would let her, but think that it's unlikely that that's going to be the case.
Has she improved since the election?
Well, I think that she has, actually. I think she's... But I don't think, the critical thing is, these are all in the eye of the beholder. Does it really matter? Right? So my view is the big things that are going to matter in politics are whether the personal income growth is going to go up, the fact the Conservative Party is going to be fighting a fourth election, and whether people are. I think she might end up being thought somewhat slightly better prime ministerial candidate than Jeremy Corbyn, but that I don't think is going to be the critical issue. So my view is yes, I think she has learnt some lessons. I think the performances are a bit more open, but I'm not sure that's the critical thing.
Who are your top picks for the job if there's a vacancy?
You mean who am I predicting should be will be the leader?
Yes.
I think it's very difficult. I think it depends when it is. I think that if it's in the shorter run, then I think Amber Rudd is a strong candidate to run from the sort of, as it were, the modernising kind of Remain area. But David Davis would, if it was in the short run, be a very strong candidate to win. But if it goes longer, then it becomes very much more difficult to predict who will be the candidate.
Should she apologise, Theresa May, for the election result in her conference speech?
Well, I'm sure she'll use some language, don't you think, that will, to the members, that will do that.
Is it the right thing to do, or do you think she should be more bullish?
I think if I was writing a speech like that, I think I probably would put some language in like that. But it's much more important that she gives people a clear idea what her plan is for Brexit, beyond what she said, takes people on a bit, and also that she put some flesh onto her domestic agenda. That's much more important than language about being sorry, although I'm sure there'll be some of that.
I mean, Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party performed better than many people expected. Yes. They themselves were much more confident. She is now parking her tanks on Labour's lawn. They have managed to put issues onto the agenda that Theresa May wouldn't necessarily, despite her speech on the steps of Downing Street of number 10, they have managed to push the agenda. Yeah, look,
and they're very strong in Parliament, as we talked about earlier, and she's got, the Conservative Party's got to recognise they've got a very good chance of winning their general election. I think there is, one of the questions you have to ask is, to what extent did the Conservative Party contribute to Labour's good performance? Because the Conservative Party did quite well in terms of numbers of votes. The problem they had was the Labour Party did much better than anyone thought and came quite close. My own view, and this is sort of an old moderniser talking, I think that some of the Conservative rhetoric and some of the Conservative stance made people unite behind an alternative out of dislike of the Conservative Party. And it's not enough simply to get people to agree with you. You also have to get those people who are against you not to hate you. And I think the Conservative Party needs to think about that and hasn't been very good about that.
There'll be loads of discussion over the conference season.